My name is Emily Carter. I'm 22, and I built my dream with my own hands. A $22,000 greenhouse. Every dollar came from my savings. Every panel installed late into the night was a piece of me. It wasn't just glass and steel. It was freedom, pride, and the future of my small organic business. For 2 years, I had worked side jobs, waiting tables, tutoring high school biology students, even cleaning offices at night, while funneling nearly every cent into this greenhouse. I studied construction manuals, watched endless tutorials, and begged advice from local farmers who thought I was crazy, but admired my determination. I had calluses on my hands that no amount of lotion could hide, bruises from hauling beams, and countless cuts from sharp panes of glass. But when the last panel was set, and the irrigation system hummed to life, I stood inside, surrounded by the warm glow of sunlight filtering through the walls, and felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had ever known. This place was proof that I could carve out a life of my own, separate from my parents' suffocating expectations and my brother Jason's chaos. Jason, older by 4 years, was everything I refused to be. He drifted from job to job, always armed with excuses. The boss didn't respect me, or the hours weren't fair. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the world owed him another chance, no matter how many he squandered. Growing up, my parents smoothed over his mistakes, bailing him out when he wrecked cars, paid off rent when landlords threatened eviction, and covered the bills when he blew his paychecks on nights out. That pattern of indulgence only hardened his entitlement. So when he came storming into my greenhouse one evening, red-faced, smelling of beer, and sneering as he demanded that I hire him, I wasn't surprised. "Simon, you owe me this," he said, jabbing a finger at me as though his words carried authority. His voice was laced with mockery, as if I was ridiculous for thinking I could run a business without him. He paced the rows of seedlings like he already owned the place, kicking at the soil beneath his boots. I told him no, I wasn't cruel about it. I explained that my business was still fragile, that I couldn't afford mistakes, and that his track record didn't inspire confidence. His face twisted, first with disbelief, then with rage. "You think you're better than me," he spat. "You think because you stuck some glass together, you get to play boss." His words echoed against the panels, and for the first time in my greenhouse, I felt unsafe. I stood my ground, heart pounding, refusing to give him what he wanted. Eventually, he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. I told myself it was just another tantrum. Jason always cooled off. But the next morning shattered that illusion. When I walked up the gravel path with my morning coffee, ready to check on the seedlings, I froze. My greenhouse, the place I had poured 2 years of sweat and sacrifice into, was gutted. Panels of glass lay in jagged shards across the ground, glittering cruelly in the sunlight. The irrigation lines were torn out, their rubber tubing twisted and dangling like veins ripped from a body. Bags of fertilizer had been slashed open, their contents spilling into dark, wet clumps across the soil. The air reeked of chemicals, acrid and sharp, mixing with the damp smell of earth. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering on stones, but I barely heard it. The world seemed to tilt, sound rushing away until all that existed was the sight of destruction. My greenhouse wasn't just damaged, it was annihilated. Then my eyes caught the mud. Heavy boot prints pressed deep into the wet ground around the greenhouse. Fresh, unmistakable. My gaze followed the trail until it landed on a familiar sight. Jason's pickup truck, parked just beyond the property line, half hidden behind a stand of trees. That was when rage roared through me, hotter and more consuming than any anger I had ever known. Betrayal burned in my chest, sharp and undeniable. My own brother had done this. He had taken the one thing I had built entirely for myself and reduced it to rubble. I stumbled into the greenhouse, glass crunching under my boots, and pressed a trembling hand to the twisted frame. My reflection wavered in the shards around me, 100 broken pieces staring back. I had always known Jason was reckless, but I never believed he would cross this line. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate. I sank to my knees in the ruined soil, my hands curling into fists, so tight my nails cut into my palms. Fury coursed through me like fire in my veins, searing away the shock, leaving only raw, blistering rage. In that moment, one truth carved itself into my heart. Jason hadn't just destroyed my greenhouse. He had declared war on everything I stood for, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. My parents' reaction was almost worse than the destruction itself. There's a special kind of ache that comes when people who raised you look at your ruin and decide it's an inconvenience, not a wound. By noon, the day the glass lay scattered like ice, Mom and Dad were standing in my gravel drive, arms folded against the wind, eyes already rehearsing a script. Jason wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. Mom, Linda, took one step into the wreckage, then retreated as if the shards might leap up and accuse her. "Emily, honey," she said, wringing her hands until her wedding band clicked. "You have to be understanding." The word understanding landed like a stone in my throat. Behind her, Dad, Robert, scanned the mess the way he used to scan my report cards, looking for an angle to make it sound better than it was. His jaw worked, as if he could chew this into something digestible. "He just wanted to teach you a lesson," Mom continued, voice trembling toward tears she'd weaponized my entire life. "You know how he is. He gets hot-headed. A lesson?" My voice broke into something unfamiliar to my own ears. Hoarse, stunned, already fraying. "He destroyed my business." Dad took a breath that smelled like the coffee he always drank too strong. "Don't be dramatic," he said quietly, a phrase that used to end arguments when I was 12. "It's broken, yes, but it's fixable. Your brother was out of line, I'll give you that. But calling the police—" I didn't say I was calling the police. I lied, because the thought had already rooted itself in my mind, like a seed seeking water. I said he destroyed my business. He nodded in that old managerial way, slow, patient, grave, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a white envelope. It looked fat at first glance, padded with apology. He held it out the way people hold out bread to stray dogs. "Here," he said, 500 for the panels or whatever, and we can all sit down and talk. No reason to make this bigger than it is." I looked at the envelope, at the neat bank logo in blue ink, at Dad's name scrawled on the flap, and something in me lurched. $500 against $22,000. A band-aid held up to a hemorrhage. Hush money that didn't even pretend to be respectful. "It's not about panels," I said. "It's about everything I put into this place. It's about the months of work, the deposits I paid, the orders I have pending. It's my livelihood." Mom's eyes filled, quick as a summer storm. "He's your brother, Emily, and I'm your daughter." That line hung in the air like a bell just struck. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then, as if a switch flipped, Mom's face hardened. "You don't talk to us like that. Not after everything we've done for you. We drove you to the farmer's market every Saturday for a year. We helped you find that contractor for the foundation. You told the contractor I couldn't afford him. I said, the memory hitting fresh. You asked him to go easy on me because I was just a girl with a hobby. Hush, Dad snapped, a rare flash of temper. He thrust the envelope closer. Take the money. We'll get a few guys from church to help clean up this weekend. The important thing is to keep this in the family. The important thing. As if the greenhouse were a gossip problem. As if my ruin were a PR incident. As if damage were shameful primarily because someone might see it. I didn't take the envelope. I didn't move at all. The silence swelled, carrying the drip of fertilizer turning into sludge where the irrigation line leaked. A bee blundered through the broken frame and fell into a pocket of spilled granular feed. Writhing, I reached out on instinct and scooped it free. My fingers stained with white dust, then set it on a dry leaf. The smallness of the gesture lodged in my ribs and twisted. I could save a bee, but not the thing I'd built. Dad mistook my stillness for softening. He placed the envelope on a patch of intact shelving and adjusted it, aligning it square, the way he aligns everything. Let's go home, he said, gentler now. Your mother made a roast. We'll talk it through. Mom's tears finally escaped, sliding neatly down, as if their path had been worn smooth by years of practice. You're cruel, she whispered, her voice tremulous and indicting all at once. Family forgives. Family forgives. A phrase that had excused 1,000 slammed doors, a dozen unpaid debts, 2 cars, borrowed, and never returned. One Thanksgiving table flipped over when the Cowboys lost. Family forgives meant I learned to pick up forks off the floor and apologize for bumping into them on the way there. Family forgives meant Linda and Robert slept soundly after Jason bellowed apologies he never meant, and I swallowed my anger like a pill. I watched them retreat up the drive, not in a huff, but with that posture of parents who believe they've done the reasonable thing and been rebuffed by an unreasonable child. They didn't slam car doors. They didn't talk loudly. They wore disappointment like coats. When the taillights disappeared, the quiet landed so hard my ears rang. I stayed until the light shifted cold and gray. Calls buzzed my phone. A vendor confirming the next batch of seed trays. A teacher asking if I could still sub next week. A friend, Natalie, whose messages I didn't open because I had no words that didn't sound like begging. I sat on an overturned soil bag, glass glittering like frost around my boots, and took inventory the way a grieving person counts the steps from the bedroom to the kitchen after a funeral. The south wall frame, bent, drip line manifold, ripped from its anchors. Timer, face cracked, the screen dead. Germination tent, slashed, its clear plastic hanging like limp skin. On the workbench, my notebook lay open, pages damp and buckled, rows of numbers dissolving into gray woolly lines, all those tiny careful calculations unspooling. When I finally stood, the cold wind found the holes in my coat and threaded itself through, a needle-pulling chill through cloth, through skin, tugging me hollow. I moved slowly, lifting trays that could be salvaged, setting ruined ones in a heap. A trage I knew was symbolic at best. Every motion found a memory. The Sunday I installed the first panel, the way the sunlight warmed my shoulders in January. The night the heater clicked on properly for the first time and I cried from relief. The message I'd sent Natalie when the first basil germinated. It works. It actually works. I had written those words with shaking hands. Now my hands shook for a different reason. I went inside the house for a while, because the sky had gone dark and the greenhouse looked like a shipwreck. In the kitchen, the fridge hummed with its bland indifference to human ruin. I poured water and couldn't drink it. I tried to calculate the exact monetary loss, and the math broke into what ifs. What if I hadn't said no? What if I'd slept in and found this later? What if I'd put a camera up last week when I thought about it? What ifs are a liar's currency, and I was flush with them. At some point, I drifted back out, the way you drift back to a grave after the crowd leaves, because leaving feels like bending to the idea that the person is gone. The moon had risen thin as a paper cut. A gust sent a fine clatter across the ground, glass settling. I sat in the ruined doorway and hugged my knees and let the crying come, the kind that makes your ribs ache and your face feel like it's been scored with salt. There's nothing performative about crying alone. It's not a spectacle, it's a collapse. Each sob found the space between bones and pride. What about my dreams? I asked the dark. What about my sacrifices? I saw the version of me who had loaded lumber in the rain because the discount ended at 5, who had eaten rice and eggs for a month to afford the irrigation pump, who had smiled at customers while calculating how many bouquets it would take to buy one more roll of polyfilm. Where did she go when family forgiveness demanded I pretend this was a misunderstanding? Somewhere out on the road, a truck downshifted and rumbled away, the sound fading into the flat quiet. My cheeks cooled. My breathing found something like rhythm. I wiped my face with the heel of my hand, grimy now with fertilizer dust. The envelope Dad left sat where he had placed it, white rectangle in the dim. I picked it up and felt the papery arrogance of it, the lie that money could buy back respect, could patch dignity, could erase intention. I set it down again, very gently, as if it might bruise the table. I didn't touch my phone. I didn't text anyone. I didn't make a plan. Not yet. Pain isn't strategic. It is present tense. It lives in the chest, in the throat, behind the eyes. It narrows the world to what it hurts to look at. And tonight, that was everything. The wind slid once more through the broken panels, carrying the faintest scent of basil, some stubborn leaf still giving off green in the cold. The smell caught me off guard, a ghost of what had been. I closed my eyes and let it sting. Then I opened them, because sleep wasn't coming and morning would. I stayed where I was, inside the wreckage, long enough that the stars felt like company. And when the crying slowed to breaths, the hurt settled into a heavy, steady thing, not lessened, but named. Family forgives, my mother had said. Family forgets, I thought. And I was not going to. I did call the police. It was one of the hardest phone calls I've ever made. My hand hovered over the keypad for long minutes, my heart pounding like a trapped bird in my chest. For 22 years, I had been trained to believe that family problems stayed behind closed doors, that calling in outsiders was betrayal. But as I looked out the window at the jagged skeleton of my greenhouse, the shards of glass catching pale morning, light like mocking stars, I knew silence was another kind of prison. So I dialed. The dispatcher's calm voice steadied me just enough to get the words out. Vandalism, property destruction, my brother. By the time the patrol car rolled up the drive, my palms were slick with sweat, my throat dry as ash. Filing the report was terrifying. My hands shook as I signed my name, each letter feeling like a permanent severing of ties. But it was also liberating. For once, I chose myself over their guilt trips, their quiet commands to forgive, forget, move on. The officers walked carefully through the wreckage, cameras clicking, boots crunching glass into dust. One crouched to photograph the deep boot prints, the torn irrigation lines, the shredded plastic of the germination tent. Another examined the slashed fertilizer bags, shaking his head slowly. They didn't say much, but their methodical attention gave me a strange kind of reassurance. Here was proof that this mattered. Here were strangers who treated my loss with the gravity my own family refused to give it. When they asked me to recount what had happened, the argument, Jason's rage, the truck parked in the trees the morning after, I felt my voice tremble but hold. For once, I didn't soften his edges, didn't make excuses like I had since childhood. I spoke the truth plainly, and in the officer's notes it became fact, not family drama. When they promised to investigate, the words didn't fix anything, but they planted something fragile inside me. It wasn't healing yet, but it was the first spark of hope I'd felt since the destruction. That hope was tested 2 days later when Jason showed up. I heard his truck before I saw him, the grinding growl of the engine rolling down the drive like a storm. Then came the pounding at my door, furious, insistent, each blow rattling the frame. "You really called the cops on me?" His voice carried through the wood, jagged with disbelief and fury. When I opened the door, he stood there wild-eyed, his jaw tight, shoulders squared like he was ready for a fight. His presence filled the doorway, his anger radiating heat. "You think they'll believe you over family?" he spat, leaning in close, his breath hot with beer and bitterness. His words were a threat disguised as a question, meant to remind me of the hierarchy I was supposed to obey. Jason untouchable, Emily the afterthought, parents the enforcers of silence. But this time, I didn't cower. My knees trembled, my pulse hammered, but I didn't step back. I looked him in the eye, refusing the old instinct to shrink. "I don't need them to believe me," I said, my voice shaking but steady enough. "The evidence speaks for itself." For a split second, his face cracked, as though the weight of certainty had shifted, as though he realized the old tactics wouldn't work anymore. He barked a bitter laugh, muttered something under his breath, and stormed off. Gravel spat from his tires as he peeled away, but I stayed rooted in the doorway, my chest rising and falling with a new rhythm. Fear hadn't disappeared, but something sturdier had settled in its place. Resolve. That night, the silence of my phone told me everything I needed to know. My parents didn't call. No texts, no voicemails, not even a curt, "Think about this." The absence stung, proof that siding with Jason mattered more than standing with me. But it also gave me clarity. If their love was conditional on my silence, then it wasn't love at all. Jason, meanwhile, spread his own version of the story around town. I heard whispers at the hardware store, felt glances at the farmer's market. Words like dramatic, vindictive, ungrateful floated around me like gnats. He painted himself as the victim of a sister too self-righteous to forgive. In a small town, reputations can shift like shadows, and I could feel mine bending under the weight of his lies. And yet, beneath the sting of gossip and the ache of estrangement, I held onto that spark. I had stood up. I had told the truth. I had chosen to believe my work, my sacrifices, my future were worth defending. At night, I sat by the skeletal frame of the greenhouse, notebook open, pen scratching across ruined pages as I recalculated costs, sketched new layouts, and dreamed stubbornly of rebuilding. Every broken beam became a line item. Every shattered panel became a reminder that I had something worth fighting for. The cold wind cut through the broken glass, but in the margins of my notes, I wrote words that steadied me. Not the end. Start again. Hope didn't roar. It flickered. But in the ashes of betrayal, even a flicker was enough to keep me warm. The courthouse smelled like dust, old paper, and something lemony that never quite masked the weight of other people's disasters. I was there before 8, clutching a manila folder that held copies of invoices, bank statements, and printed photos of my greenhouse, the way it had looked before, and the way it looked after. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly. A bailiff with a salt and pepper mustache held the door for me with a nod that felt like a blessing. I sat on a wooden bench outside Department C and traced the grain with my thumb. My name, Emily Carter, was typed on a docket sheet thumbtacked to a corkboard. Beneath it, State v. Jason Carter. Seeing our last names split by the word versus did something surgical to me. Neat, clean, undeniable. The assistant district attorney, Megan Alvarez, sleeve neatly rolled, legal pad already scribbled through, found me and introduced herself with a handshake firm enough to borrow courage. "You're the complaining witness," she said, and the title steadied my spine more than I expected. Witness, not troublemaker. Witness, not tattletale. Jason arrived 10 minutes before the call time. Swagger first, posture a performance. He wore a suit I'd never seen before, one shade too shiny, the kind of charcoal that squeaked when he moved. The grin hadn't changed. It still curled at one side, as if he shared a private joke with the universe. Behind him came my parents. Linda in a blouse I recognized from holiday dinners, Robert in the tan blazer he called his Sunday jacket. Mom's eyes skimmed over me and away. Dad's mouth tightened, the muscle in his jaw working a familiar rhythm. They sat on the opposite bench and didn't speak. I studied the toe of my shoe until a bailiff called us in. Inside, the courtroom felt both grand and small, like a church built in miniature. The judge's bench rose a step above us all. The seal behind it glinted. We stood when Judge Marion Porter entered, her robe catching a draft and settling around her like a curtain. She had a composed face, the kind that did not overreact, and a voice that sounded like it had said the words, "Good morning," to 1,000 people on their worst day. We sat at her instruction. The clerk read the case number. The court reporter poised her fingers over a steno machine, waiting to trap every syllable we let out. The opening moments slid by in procedure. Acknowledgement of counsel, confirmation of charges, Jason's plea of not guilty spoken by an overworked public defender with a crooked tie, and a soft, quick voice. Then the ADA began. She was crisp without being cruel. "Your Honor, the state will show that the defendant, Jason Carter, intentionally destroyed approximately $22,000 worth of property belonging to his sister, the complaining witness, after she declined to hire him at her greenhouse business. She used the word intentionally, like a stake." Officer Derek Boone of the county sheriff's office took the stand first. He had photographed my ruin the morning he responded, and he walked the court through each image as Ms. Alvarez moved them into evidence. Exhibit A, south wall frame twisted out of alignment. Exhibit B, shredded germination tint. Exhibit C, torn drip line, manifold, and dangling irrigation tubes. On the projector screen, the photos filled the room, larger than life, softening no edge. I watched the people in the seats behind the bar go still, heads tilting, expressions flattening into that polite, shocked neutrality strangers wear when handed the intimacy of someone else's loss. "Officer Boone," Ms. Alvarez said, "did you note any identifying marks?" Yes, he said, flipping through his report. Boot impressions in fresh mud, deep tread, consistent with a size 11 work boot. They tracked from the south end of the greenhouse to the north door and back. Also, tire impressions. A truck with all-terrain treads on the margin of the Carter property's rear access. He described how he measured the impressions, how he photographed them with a ruler laid alongside, how he recorded the pattern. He didn't mention Jason's name until Ms. Alvarez asked whether anyone had been seen or reported in the vicinity. Then he said, a vehicle matching the tread pattern, an older model Chevy pickup, was observed by the witness the morning of the incident parked on the access road behind a stand of trees. His eyes didn't flick to Jason when he said, he didn't need to. I testified next. I told the story the way I had practiced in my head. Brief, chronological, precise. The argument in my greenhouse, the refusal to hire him, the anger that followed. The next morning's discovery, the truck, the boot prints, the ruin, my call to law enforcement. Ms. Alvarez showed the court my documents, invoices for glass and steel, receipts for the irrigation system, bank statements showing debits that added to a number that still made my throat tighten. The judge glanced at each, nodded once, and the clerk marked them accordingly. When the public defender cross-examined me, he was cordial, almost apologetic. Miss Carter, is it fair to say your brother has helped your family in the past? He's family, I answered, not elaborating. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. Is it possible, he tried again, that your brother was attempting to make a point, however misguided, about your refusal to include him in your business? Not possible, I said. He destroyed it. Jason's turn at the stand was a theater piece he had rehearsed in the mirror. He leaned back as if the chair offended him. He said the words, teach her a lesson, like they were benevolent. He shrugged at phrases like property damage and malicious mischief, floated the suggestion that insurance was going to cover it anyway, and glanced at the gallery as though waiting for nods. He even attempted an apology that wasn't one. I shouldn't have gone that far, but she pushed me. When Ms. Alvarez asked what lesson required a pry bar and a knife, he smiled, stopped smiling, then faltered. The room felt it, the wobble in the performance, the way the mask didn't quite stay on. Closing arguments crystallized what the photos had already said. Ms. Alvarez stood with her hand lightly on the edge of counsel table and spoke of labor, the kind you can't shortcut, of small businesses held together by grit and thin margins, of the plain fact that someone else's arrogance isn't a legal defense. The public defender gestured toward family dynamics and emotionally charged decisions, but the words sounded like gauze pressed to a wound you could see throbbing. Judge Porter's ruling came without theatrics. She removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and looked at Jason the way a person looks at a thing that could be useful if it stopped being stubborn. Mr. Carter, she said, this court is not in the business of enforcing family etiquette. It is in the business of enforcing the law. Teaching your sister a lesson is not a justification for destroying her property. Her voice was even, but the word not landed like a gavel. She ordered restitution in the amount documented, $22,000, payable on a schedule under court supervision. She added 200 hours of community service with an organization not connected to our town's cozy network, the sort of work that stains clothes and humbles posture. There were fines, fees, the paperwork choreography of accountability. When she asked if I wished to speak, I said no. The evidence had already said enough. The bailiff called the next case. Chairs scraped. People flowed toward the aisles. Jason stood slowly as if gravity had doubled. His grin was missing. In its place, a blank space opened where charm used to be. The public defender whispered. Jason nodded without listening. My parents, still on the back bench, sat very still, then rose as one. I didn't try to read their faces. I had, for the first time in months, stopped reading everyone but myself. On the courthouse steps, winter sunlight glanced off the marble and made me squint. Ms. Alvarez pressed a copy of the order into my hands. Crisp pages, official ink, then shook my hand, said take care, and was swept into the tide of other people's mornings. I turned and there they were, Linda and Robert at the top of the stairs on the opposite side, their expressions fixed in that practiced hurt that had steered our family for years. Their gaze met mine and held. It didn't pull me anywhere. It didn't make me smaller. It just passed through me like wind. I put the order into my folder, smoothed the flap, and drew a breath that reached all the way down. The courthouse doors swung behind me, steady and heavy, as if the building itself approved of conclusion. My name on the paper felt different from my name on the docket. Not a versus, not a battle, just a fact attached to a boundary I had drawn and defended. They could call me cruel. They could call me unfilial, ungrateful, difficult. The labels slid off. What stayed was simple. I had told the truth. I had been heard. And for once in his life, Jason had been held to the ground by something other than our excuses. Rebuilding wasn't a montage. It was slow work that lived under my fingernails and in the ache between my shoulder blades. It was early morning cold biting through a sweatshirt while I hauled twisted frame pieces into a rented dumpster. It was the whine of a cordless drill at midnight. It was receipts stacked like thin bricks on my kitchen table. I signed papers I swore I'd never need. Small business loan documents with tidy paragraphs and big numbers. Feeling equal parts relief and shame, and beneath both, a steady thread of resolve. If debt was the bridge between ruin and daylight, then I would walk it with my head up. The first days were triage. I sifted glass with a snow shovel into heavy contractor bags, the scrape a metronome that steadied my breath. I vacuumed the smallest shards with an industrial shop vac until the nozzles sang against bare concrete. I pried bent brackets off the sill with a crowbar, levering metal away from the bolts one stubborn fraction at a time. When my palms blistered, I taped them. When the tape bowled gummy residue, I scrubbed it off and kept going. Then came decisions, the kind you only make after something has been taken from you. I upgraded the frame to heavier gauge steel. I ordered tempered, laminated glass that wouldn't explode into knives at the lightest insult. I doubled the fasteners at the stress points and added diagonal bracing along the long walls so the structure's geometry carried its own confidence. I relayed the manifold and drip lines in tidy loops, adding shoot-off valves to each zone. I rewired the thermostat and added a second as backup, both feeding into a little control box I labeled like a kindergarten teacher. AEAT, VNT, DURIPA, DURIPB. This time, nothing got built without a clearly labeled redundancy. The town watched me work the way a congregation watches someone return to a pew after a long absence. With curiosity, with caution, with something like hope. At Bennett's Hardware, Carl, the owner with sawdust creases in his palms, offered me bulk pricing on greenhouse screws before I asked. He counted them out by feel and slid the box across the counter with a quiet, "Pay me when you can." At the nursery on Maple, Denise tucked 2 flats of heirloom tomato starts, Brandywine and Cherokee Purple, into my cart and said, "No charge. Call it a community investment." My neighbor Iva, 16 and allergic to silence, strapped on work gloves, and spent a Saturday ferrying debris to the dumpster while narrating the drama of her high school chemistry class. I paid her with pizza and a hug and the promise of as many marigolds as she could carry. Not all help was visible. I'd come home from a long day of scraping adhesive to find a brown paper bag on my porch, a loaf of bread still warm, a jar of honey, a note written in careful cursive, for the days that take more than they give. Nora, an older man I knew only as the beekeeper with the blue truck, left a stack of cedar slats by the gate, perfect for new seat benches, and a post-it, strong wood, doesn't warp. Inside the new shell, I reimagined the space. I raised the central benches 6 inches to save my back and give the lower leaves more air. I sanded every surface and sealed them with linseed oil so spilled water gleamed and ran off instead of soaking in to brew mildew. I sketched a grid on graph paper, then brought it to life in wood and pipe. Tall basil and kale on the north side, lower herbs on the south to drink in winter sun, microgreens in tight trays near the workstation for quick harvests. The sink got a deeper basin, the compost got a tighter lid, the hose got a swivel that didn't kink. In the upper peak, I installed automatic vent openers, the wax pistons that lift and lower louvers as the temperature shifts, so the building itself learned to breathe without me. Money remained a hum at the edge of everything, but I learned to make it a rhythm, not a siren. I kept a ledger on a clipboard and a second one in a spreadsheet, each entry a little stake driven into the ground to mark what I had done and what it had cost. When the loan disbursed, I didn't celebrate. I converted dollars to glass, to steel, to soil, to seed. When customers messaged to ask when I'd reopen, I answered with honesty and a date I refused to treat as a wish. The day the replacement glass arrived, the delivery driver whistled when he saw the stacks, pallets wrapped like gifts from a stern uncle. He helped me carry panes into the frame bay by bay. We moved like a 2-person orchestra. Lift, balance on suction handles, step, breathe, seek the pane, set the clip, click. The sound of each clip catching, small, decisive, became a promise. When we slid the final pane into place, sunlight poured through, clean and whole, landing on my face so warmly, I closed my eyes and let it crown me. I ran a fingertip along the bead of sealant where it met the frame, unbroken. Systems came alive again, one by one. The heater lit with a muffled whumph. The thermostat ticked to life. The drip lines filled and pulsed. The vent arms lifted like slow wings. I set trays, basil, dill, cilantro, chives, a flat of alpine strawberries just because the notion of sweetness made my chest loosen. The first time new seedlings pushed a nap of green across the soil, I stood over them with my palms open the way people stand over cradles. Word got out, not because I courted it, but because stories move the way water finds low places. A woman from the elementary school placed a standing order for herb bundles for the teacher's lounge.